What is the purpose of assessment? How can we humanize assessment through story? And what does it take to lead an assessment revolution in our schools? Welcome back to another episode of the Teachers on Fire podcast, airing live on YouTube every Saturday morning at 8 a.m. Pacific, 11 a.m. Eastern. My name is Tim Cavey, and my mission here is to warm your heart, spark your thinking, and ignite your professional practice. Today's Teacher on Fire is Natalie Vardabasso. Natalie has served as a high school and middle school teacher, instructional coach, and an assessment lead. Today, she's an assessment speaker, consultant, author, and podcaster. She's also the founder of the Empowerment Ecosystem, an online community that amplifies the impact of change agents in the K-12 education system. You can follow Natalie on LinkedIn, on X and Instagram at Natabasso, and on her website at empowermentecosystem.com/summit, as well as her podcast, EduCrush. Natalie, thank you so much for coming on the show today. Are you ready to light it up?
Let's get lit up.
All right. Well, before we jump into your work and mission, and there is so much to talk about there, could we start with story time? Would you share a story of adversity with us that you faced somewhere in your teaching or professional journey? And then, of course, describe how you overcame it.
Oh, man. I feel like, there's so many stories. I'm going to tell the story that in many ways as a teacher was the catalyst for me becoming obsessed with all things assessment, which is not exactly the most sexy part of our job, I like to say. If you want to clear a room at a party, they're like, what do you do? And you're like, I'm an assessment and grading consultant. They're like, okay, bye. But first year teaching, like anyone, big dreams. I wanted to meet incredible outcomes for kids. I was hired at a special education independent school in Calgary, Alberta. And I never thought I'd work in an independent school. I'm not philosophically for private education. However, I have an older brother with severe mental and physical disabilities. So I was like, okay, I can get behind this. And I trusted them because I was like, this is kind of a niche. They probably know what they're doing. I'm just going to go along with the flow. And our assessment practices were very traditional. We were the data-rich, information-poor type of context. And so I remember we did our first round of data collection, and we had all different kinds of online programs to test where kids were at with reading and stuff. And I was sitting with a parent in an interview, brand new teacher, terrified, and I had all these data spreadsheets. And this parent who's paid so much money to send their kid to the school, it's like their last hope to help their kid find success in education. I just had to share this basically meaningless data that was all over the map. And when they looked at me and they were so anxious and they were like, well, what do I do to help my kid read? I actually said, read more? Like, what? That's the worst advice ever. But I had no idea how to even break down reading. Reading wasn't something that was hard for me or that I had to really struggle with. And so that was the first moment where I knew something had to change, where I was like, okay, I have to be able to talk to parents about what is reading, what are the parts of reading, how do I notice and name strengths kids have with reading so that I could better name their areas for growth. So that was the first step I took towards building a reading comprehension rubric, which is something that had never been talked about before in that context. And that just became the catalyst because as soon as I could break down reading, I could see gains, I could have better conversations with parents. I actually looked forward to parent-teacher interviews, and that just has sparked so many other inquiries, if you will, into assessment for me.
So good. I love that. What does proficiency look like and where are we trying to go? What are the steps or gradations that are involved on our way to getting there? All of that rich stuff. And we talked about that in a recent conversation here on the pod. Can't wait to get into more of that. First, though, Natalie, I want to congratulate you on hosting yet another successful edition of the Empowerment Ecosystem Summit, this one right here in Vancouver. What's your ultimate mission and vision for these events?
Mission, I would say the driving purpose is we are trying to gather the people who lead from the middle of the education system to build community, first and foremost, and then to empower them to grow their tools as visionary catalysts for change. So the middle part, or the community part, is so important because though I say people who lead from the middle, the truth is if you're someone who's trying to make change in education, you feel more like the misunderstood middle child a lot of the time, especially if you're in one of those new roles that's like coach, consultant, lead, comma, dash. Like there's always so many words that collapse in there because you're not teacher enough for the teachers. You're not leader enough for the leaders. And yet you're like, hey, let's think outside of the status quo. And people are like, That's not how we do things here. So I was like, these people need a space where they can come together, find their people, because there's strength in community, as we know, feel like they belong. And then when we're all in the same room, how do we get some knowledge mobility happening to really expand our voices and impact, and then know that we have this community behind us when we head back to our context.
So good. Yes. I think there are a lot of people out there who want to drive change and maybe feel a little bit, I don't want to say suffocated. Maybe that's too strong, but frustrated. Yeah. Depending on the context, I suppose. Danelle is joining us here. Good morning, Danelle. She says, yay, leading from the middle.
Hi, Danelle.
Yes. Absolutely. So that's the way change is made sometimes. And you teased a little bit on one of your social media platforms. Are you thinking about other locations for future summits?
We are. Well, after we finished the summit so we started in just Vancouver last year, and then we kind of did the second round in Vancouver just a couple weeks ago. We also spread to Calgary this year. And when we were in Calgary, we had so many folks from Saskatchewan show up. And we heard no less than probably 20 times, when are you doing this in Saskatchewan? We have so many people who we'd love to send and who'd benefit from this. So we're committed to next year expanding to Saskatchewan. And we have bigger dreams of maybe finding a way to get into the United States as well.
Nice. Okay, well, keep us posted on that. Natalie, let's start big picture. When we talk about assessment, let's start right at the top. What is the purpose of assessment?
I mean, the obvious answer, which let's just get it out of the way so we can get to the deeper purpose, is to gather evidence of student learning. And then we can make decisions with that evidence. Do we want to use it to inform our next steps, or do we want to use it to verify that learning has happened and communicate to stakeholders? But it's so much deeper than that, because when we put all of the pieces of our assessment literacy into place, we create the conditions for students to become assessors on their own behalf, which is really what it's all about. This is the fastest pathway towards student ownership, student investment, student independence. If we don't have clarity on, like you said, what's our goals, what does proficiency look like, we can never create the conditions for students to start to gather that evidence, make decisions, verify whether or not they've made it, which is really what we're after. I think we all want more student investment and independence.
Yeah, I didn't hear you say there, it's something that we use to coerce the behavior that we want to see in the classroom. I'm so surprised that didn't come out there.
Isn't that what we do with grades? Wait.
Oh, man. I just heard something yesterday that made me cringe, but let's move on. Another theme that I know is close to your heart, and I think connects with a current project that you are working on, this idea of using story more in the classroom or in the learning environment to rehumanize assessment. What are we talking about when we talk about using story in this way?
Well, first, let's double tap on that word rehumanize, because I feel like it's starting to become a word that people are saying more and more. But what does it really mean? It sounds nice. It's better than dehumanize. But when I think of the concept of rehumanizing, story is the number one thing we have to pay attention to, because stories are integral to our humanity. When I hear your story, I'm immediately going to be pulled into it. I'm going to feel something. And then finally, stories are how we build our cultures, because if we each individually make sense of the world through story, then our culture is really just a collection of shared stories that we all believe to be true. So story is fundamental to our humanity. And that's with that understanding in mind, it started to occur to me that if we can empower students to be storytellers, they're going to make deeper meaning. They're going to have more empathy for one another, which is going to form greater community, and it's going to form a culture of learning in our schools. So story is really just another valid means of assessment. It would be what would be considered a performance assessment, because it's a constructed response in an authentic setting, because we are living through the democratization of storytelling in our world today with social media. This is really the first time in history that, like we're doing right now, we can no longer just consume content. We're empowered to create and to be storytellers and to have a voice and to be a leader in all kinds of different spaces and communities. So it's a way to rehumanize our experience in school, because for too long, assessment has been, I'll just name it, a dehumanizing process. It's very extractive, it's very cold, it's very individual, it's very evaluative. So how do we change that space to something where students can make deeper meaning, find empathy with one another, and build a positive learning culture?
I resonate with so much of that. And I think about portfolios and the ways that maybe we should be using them in the learning environment. And I feel like, my school has Seesaw and we use it to an extent. I feel like there's so much more to it in terms of exactly what you're talking about, telling that complete story of the learning journey, which gives so much dignity to the learner, right? And allows them to really own the journey that they're on so learning is no longer something happening to them, right? It's something that they are a part of.
Exactly.
Thank you for joining us, Teachers on Fire. If you're getting value from this conversation, give this video a like. Natalie, recently I noticed a great tweet, and let me see if I have the graphic here. Okay, here it is. You tweeted, "There's one assessment that is critical for every teacher to learn to administer accurately. Is this a can't do or a didn't do situation? Many often assess it's the latter when it's actually the former. So can you say more about this? I think that's such an important distinction."
Well, I have to give credit where credit's due. I didn't come up with this idea. Okay. It comes from my good friend and colleagues, Tom Schimmer's book, Grading from the Inside Out. But it's a part of the larger conversation around redefining accountability. Because for so long, like we've talked about, grades have been the tool to coerce students to do all the kinds of things we want them to do. And yet, the more we leverage our grade books for behavioral compliance, the less accurate our grades become. And so with that in mind, we need a different means of intervening when students fall short. So they don't do the work, or it's not done to a quality that we would expect, or it's not done on time, whatever falls short means. And having worked with teachers across North America this year, I would say this is the number one thing that they are frustrated about and they are focused on, especially as you move into the high school level. And they won't use the word didn't do, they'll often use the phrase won't do. Because there'll be an assumption of mindset, the kid doesn't care. The kid's being defiant. The kid's being a jerk. They don't respect me, whatever the case may be, which is usually coming from a very vulnerable place of I'm not totally sure what to do. But the truth is, if we want it, we have to teach it. So we need to make this distinction first to understand what exactly is it that we need to teach in this moment when a student falls short. And if they didn't do the work, there needs to be opportunities to support them to get the work done or to learn some executive functioning skills, better time management, better task initiation. But there needs to be some kind of a response to say, I see this, I'm responding, because what is not an option is choosing to opt out. If the work is essential to our assessment of the standard or the outcome under study, then we need to gather evidence of the work. The only natural consequence for not doing work is doing the work. So we need to support them to do that. And then on the other side of the ledger, if they can't do the work, if we have evidence to believe they're struggling, then we intervene, we help them, we reteach. We don't turn to our grade book for an academic or for a behavioral misstep. So if a student doesn't do the work because they can't, we don't then punish them in the grade book. Just like if they failed a math test, we wouldn't suspend them. Like that doesn't make sense. So if there's an academic misunderstanding, then we intervene, we help. And the truth is, as someone coming from special ed, that's the majority of what's happening in classrooms. Kids have just gotten really good at saying all kinds of things to make us think that they don't care about the course, or they're too good for it, or it's too boring. And this is very gendered too. I find this is more typical with male students, but we have to get very clear. And that usually requires something's happened. I check in with a kid. I have a conversation. I don't just go to my grade book, enter in the zeros so I can wipe it from my mind and move on to the next topic.
Yeah. And sort of pat ourselves on the back and say, I've done the just thing, Well, actually, no, the far better, the far more justice oriented response is to pursue the student. And I love the line that you said about the only natural consequence to work not done is to do the work. That's so good. I'm going to have to try to save that one, because there's no punishment required. There's just following up with the student and the learner. On a related note, or somewhat related, let's say, is one of my pet peeves. I had to have you speak to this one. How do you feel about bonus work and marks, Natalie?
Well, it goes right back to what I was saying. If we're leveraging our grade books for behavioral compliance, we're going to have less accurate grades. So bonus work or bonus marks is really a behavioral tool. Like I'm going to dangle a carrot and say, if you do this extra bit of work for me, and let's be honest, sometimes it's like getting Kleenex from the office, or like bringing cans in for the food drive, or I've seen bonus marks for like just showing up to the band performance, like whatever it may be. But as soon as you do that, what you're doing is you're taking your final grade, which is a B, and we're going, okay, is that a B because a student has an A level of academic understanding, it's what they know and can do, but a C level of this compliance and behavioral reward? Or is it that they are really well behaved, they're a pleasure to have in class, bonus marks galore, but the truth is they actually have a C level of understanding? And so as soon as we start mixing this into the grades, then we have no clear picture of where students at, what they know and can do, or as the assessment literature would say, we can't make valid interpretations from that grade. So I want my grades to mean something. I want them to communicate exactly what my students know and can do, because getting them all there is hard work. And I don't want to muddy those waters with other stuff. Do I not believe in extension though, or enrichment opportunities? Of course not. I think that's wonderful. Provide all kinds of extension enrichment opportunities for all kids all the time. Expose them to that. But let's not use our grade books for behavioral compliance, because we want accurate grades.
We do. Yes. And that connects so closely with standards-based grading, right? Because I've seen marks given out for packing up the chairs and cleaning up the equipment after the band concert. You mentioned band for a moment. And I would just say, what's the standard there? What's the curricular competency there, right? So as long as we're focused on the learning target and collecting evidence that is focused, it keeps us out of those waters.
Yeah.
You've now published over 110 episodes on the EduCrush podcast, Natalie. And to my Teachers on Fire listeners, if you are tuning in on the audio-only version of this podcast, make sure you surf on over and subscribe to the EduCrush podcast. I have to say, Natalie, one of the most polished and substantive podcasts out there, I think, in our space. Who do you feature? And for others new to your podcast, what can listeners expect to take away there?
Well, it's very similar to the aims of the Empowerment Ecosystem Summit. I wanted to give a voice to those people who were leading change in education, because I know so often they're in spaces where it feels like they're hitting a brick wall every day. They're being told, oh, that won't work for our kids, or you don't understand how we do things here, or, oh, we tried that once back in 2002 and it didn't work. So I wanted a space for these people who are leading change to tell their story of impact, why they're leading change, the barriers they're bumping up against, and offer a sense of community and inspiration for others who want to impact change. So I've got all kinds of guests that are published authors like Peter Liljedahl and Penny Kittle, and some even authors that are not from the education space. That's been a really interesting exploration for me on there. Is I think we often think of education as just K-12 school, and it's so much more. So one of my favorite interviews was an author named Elizabeth Lesser. She wrote a book called Cassandra Speaks. And the tagline is, when women are the storytellers, the human story changes. So I love to also bring in people who are getting us to think differently on a societal level. And this was a guest whose previous podcast was Oprah's. So no pressure there, but it's all people who are getting us to think differently, inspiring us to learn and to move forward as human beings.
That's amazing. And I love how fearless you are in terms of going after those crushes, because
that's
I know sometimes as the small time creator and content, the educator, it's hard. Take some courage to make those asks, but good for you. And thank you again for all the content you provide there. Speaking of education in other contexts, and you, by the way, are an educator, I know you will say to people, let's talk about this professional pivot that you've been public about on LinkedIn and encouraged others to consider. What would you say to that highly competent educator? Maybe they've been in the classroom for a period of decades. They're ready for some kind of a pivot into another space, but they find themselves paralyzed by doubt.
Well, first of all, that's always going to be there, even once you've made the pivot. I think there's a great quote by Stephen Pressfield. He wrote a book called The War of Art. And there's another kind of a sub book to that called Do the Work. And I go back to it as almost like a spiritual text for me that I meditate on. But he says in there over and over to anyone who wants to create, which a pivot is an act of creation. It's an act of doing something different that's never been done before. He says you have to start before you're ready. And I completely subscribe to that too, is everyone feels doubt, everyone feels worry and fear. But if you keep waiting for that perfect moment where you know enough and you're old enough and you're wise enough and you're experienced enough, you're going to be waiting forever because it doesn't come. The only way that we get clarity and confidence is to take that first step. And it's messy and hard, and we often fall right on our face. I've got some epic failure stories from my early days of leaving my job. But through that, I got so much confidence because I'm like, well, it'll never be worse than that. So might as well keep moving forward. And another way to look at this is the founder actually of LinkedIn. He has this great quote where he said, if you're proud of your first product or whatever it is. Like, okay, so say that you want to write a book or you want to do an online program or you want to offer consulting services. He said, if you're proud of your first product, you launch too late, which I've always loved that. You've got to just lean into that messiness, because if we perfect things, and we're such perfectionists in education, it's going to become precious to us. And then as soon as we get critical feedback from the user, if you will, we're going to not want to change, because we're like, no, you don't understand. I did it this way on purpose. And then it's probably going to fail.
That is rich. I love that. Mm-hmm. That really mirrors everything that went into the start of this podcast. And I'm sure to some extent you have a similar story. I mean, once you start creating content in a new environment, it's hard. It's not easy. Do you subscribe, just as a quick follow-up, Natalie, do you subscribe to this idea that maybe we exceed our own expectations or we do our best work when our back is up against the wall, in a sense? I don't know if that's the right way to put it, but do you know what I'm asking there?
Yeah, no, there's a book often that this comes up a lot around assessment, right? Folks are like, but we need these high pressure situations so kids learn how to rise to the occasion under pressure. There's a book by, their last names are Weisinger and Polly Fry, and it's called Performing Under Pressure. And the whole book is the research into this concept. And they actually debunk the myth very early on that some people rise to the occasion. The truth is, sometimes when we're under pressure, all of our cognitive abilities are a little bit diminished.
Yeah.
And we can learn, though, how to not fall as far by building our coat of armor, as they say. So our confidence, optimism, tenacity, and enthusiasm. And how do we do that? It's like I just said, you got to get in there and start and be willing to make mistakes and willing for it to be messy. And that's the fastest way to get to that point where you're in the pressure moment, but you're performing at as close to an optimal level as possible. But when I first went out on a stage, oh my gosh, this is like the ultimate fail story. So my very first contract out of my job, I got called to Reno, Nevada to do a launch for standards-based grading for 250 principals in a big district. And so many things went wrong about the day. And I was so nervous to present that I had basically scripted the whole keynote like a monologue. So I had no room for improv. So like 2 students got up right before me and talked about how much they hate standards-based grading because their school was piloting it. Opportunity, didn't take it. So I get up and I just start, going through my script, and I got so nervous. And I've been a theater performer, actor my whole life, been on many stages. I got so nervous. I lost my voice, lost it, was struggling. So someone ran up to give me water. It was the most painful hour I think anyone's ever sat through. And I thought, maybe it's not that bad. Maybe it's just in my head and I'm being hard on myself. And a week later, they called and were like, yeah, we're going to cancel the remaining 4 keynotes. Thank you so much for your time. And I was like, okay. And that was my first, okay, you know what? My back was against the wall, high pressure. It was my very first. And I think almost because I convinced myself it was so high pressure, I made it even worse of a performance. So it's a yes and to answer your question. Yeah. I don't think any of us perform better under pressure, but through repeated exposure and willingness to make mistakes, we can build that confidence, optimism, tenacity, and enthusiasm as you get better and better at it.
Thank you for sharing that story. I've read it on one of your posts, but it's so stunning and I think traumatizing even just to read it secondhand. But the way you've powered through and become so eloquent and confident, Natalie, is just remarkable. And I think it inspires a lot of others. Yeah, I asked the question, I think about one of my favorite entrepreneurs and creators, Pat Flynn, who was fired. The journey of his entrepreneurship path was him being fired as an architect during the 2008 recession. And then, it's like, well, what am I going to do? And then from there, he built this incredible new journey. And I just think sometimes there's more within us than we realize, right? And it's there. We just need to be in that situation where we actually have to bring it out.
Let me double tap, because in the entrepreneurship space, I feel that you do have to burn a bridge in a way. I feel that I've talked to so many people since, we've started coaching folks on making this pivot and building their business that are kind of dabbling and keeping one foot in the safety of their job. And so they don't want to push themselves into those very uncomfortable spaces. They just want to try to find something, and it's not going to work. There is a point here where, yes, it's going to be hard and it's not going to be easy and we're going to make mistakes. But if you don't go all in, you're never going to go through the messiness of that steep learning curve and get to where you want to go. And I feel like it's just a way of delaying until they get to that readiness place, which we've talked about doesn't exist. So there is something here for if you want to do it, like anything, you've got to invest and put out to the universe, I am all in. This is the only option I have. I'm putting all my eggs in this basket, and then it will start to work for you and things will start to fall into place.
Well said. Mark Ryan is on LinkedIn. Thanks for joining us, Mark, from the Middle East. He says willingness to make mistakes. And going back a couple of questions, Jeremy, also on LinkedIn, says, I prefer standards-based grading. Well, you're in the right place, Jeremy. Thank you for joining us, both of you, and to others who are hanging out here as well. If you're considering, if you're enjoying this conversation, consider adding the Teachers on Fire YouTube channel to your morning commute. Natalie, as we start to wind down with some quicker questions here, outside of education, what's another area of learning for you? What is it that ignites your passions away from professional learning and brings you alive as a human being?
There's two answers here. I feel like dance and music have always been an integral part of my life. I haven't been to dance classes in a while, and that's a number one. Like, I've got a wellness planner right here that's like, book the dance class. But that's been something that connects me to something that feels bigger than myself. It feels, it's a type of energy I can't find anywhere else. So I'll forever be obsessed with dance and dance classes. But I would add on to that, we've probably been talking about it, so it's clear. As I'm pivoting out of education, the shift into entrepreneurship has been very fascinating. And I'm loving concepts like marketing and sales and these things that for years, I would have turned my nose at that and been like, ugh, that's a business thing. We don't deal with that in education. But the truth is, it all comes from the same place. It's all grounded in relationship, and it's all grounded in understanding and where people are at and helping move them to where they want to go. So I'm really enjoying learning about that space.
Share about one personal habit or productivity hack that contributes to your success and keeps your fire burning. And I'll just say that off air, we talked about things like flight delays and travel frustrations. I mean, Natalie, those would wreck so many people. So in those challenging environments, how do you stay focused and productive?
A practice of morning pages has been huge. And I don't do a lot. Even if I only have like 5 minutes, I open a journal every single morning right after I wake up. And I just fill in 3 sentences. The first is, I will let go of. And I think about what's going on that I'm holding on to. Maybe it's an emotion or a thing or a belief or a story. Write that out. And then I say, I am grateful for, and I try to list something odd. Like, I'll try to pick something in my environment or something going on and really reflect on the gratitude for it. And then finally, today I will focus on, and I typically choose an emotion. So when I first started this process, I would wrongly put all of the things I was going to do that day, and it would just immediately increase my anxiety and have the opposite effect.
Yes,
so I've learned to say things like, today I will focus on peace. And then I find my mind will constantly come back to that throughout the day and be like, okay, but how do I find peace in this moment? Do I need to take a breath? Do I need to step outside? What is it I need to do? But that practice in the mornings has been integral for just getting me grounded and ready to handle whatever craziness the day throws at me.
Love that. Tell us about someone that we should follow on Education X, Instagram, or LinkedIn, and share why they've been inspiring you lately.
Oh, well, I'm going to shout out someone who already made a comment, but she is leading incredible work, Danelle Almaraz. She was one of our OG founding members of the empowerment ecosystem when it was just living as an online program and not an in-person event. But she is someone who has, been... She's pivoted. She's made the terrifying leap into saying, okay, I've done great things in my context. How do I help other schools? And she is deeply passionate about understanding systems and organizational change. And she shares so many resources and ideas and stories for anyone who's thinking about, okay, I'm a leader, either by title or by influence. How do I actually make an impact? So shout out to Danelle.
All right. Point us to an EdTech tool or app that you currently love using somewhere in your professional practice.
Well, I'll tell you about one I just was introduced to and I've just been dabbling in, but I'm so fascinated by. I was at a tech conference out in Saskatchewan last month, and they closed with this activity on this tool, but it's called CuriPod. So CURI, kind of like curious. But it's a step beyond tools like Nearpod and the ones that a lot of folks are probably familiar with, where you can write into it, I want to create a lesson on copy and paste your standard or outcome. And it creates a whole AI augmented set of slides that have all of these opportunities for students to engage. So they can draw, they can write, they can choose answers. There's tons of different things they can do. But the beauty of it is as they submit that answer, AI reads it or views the image and it gives them immediate feedback. And so that's one I've got my eye on. Of course, like many AI tools, sometimes the feedback is like, But I'm like, but what a cool thing that it's in beta mode to bring it to the kids, because it would get their critical thinking going, right? Like, was that feedback helpful? Do you feel it was on target? Was it not? Did anyone have good feedback? So that's one I've been suggesting to a lot of folks lately and wanting to play on more myself.
I really appreciate that, because I see CuraPod mentioned in sort of a group of 5 or 6 AI tools for teachers right now, sort of in the same conversation with Magic School and EduAid and others. And I didn't realize that it was based around slide decks, or it sounds like that's at least an important part of it. And that makes so much sense. So I'll definitely have to experiment with that this summer. Recommend a book, Natalie. I know you are a reader and of course an author as well. Is there one that you've been reading lately, or perhaps one of your all-time faves that's been deeply influential?
There's one I want to cite, but I feel like everyone cites it, so I'm not going to do the Adam Grant one. But one I read a while back when I was really at the beginning of my change journey, and it's not an education book, but it's totally an education book, if you know what I mean, based on the definition I gave earlier. It's called 21 Lessons for the 21st Century by an Israeli history professor, Yuval Noah Harari. He also wrote a book called Sapiens. A lot of folks know that one, where it's like the full human history. But this book is his look at the present moment that we are living in. And he talks about it as the age of bewilderment and just how to make sense of what's happening. And then based off his breadth of knowledge in history and repetition in human patterns and understanding of kind of what's coming next. But that's one that when I read it, I was like, I highlighted and had to reflect and had to journal on so many of the passages. And he really offers this idea that we are storytelling beings and that our stories are crumbling because of the amount of information available, that we don't have this cultural cohesion we once had. And that's leading to all of these problems. But that was the first book that really planted in my head, the idea of the power of story, but gave me a lens to look at the world through today, to have a better sense of what's happening, to not have a sense of futility or, like, at worst, nihilism about the world as it is right now. So I highly recommend that one for anyone who's feeling overwhelmed with the state of things today.
Just for fun, Natalie, what are you streaming during your downtime right now? Is there something on one of the streaming services that you've been enjoying?
Do you know what I just watched? It's so dark, but I can't stop thinking about it, especially because of all the fallout since it aired on Netflix. But this show, Baby Reindeer. Have you heard of this? Oh my gosh.
I tried an episode or two. Yeah. Oh.
Some folks are, I'm going to warn anyone who's listening. It's very dark and it gets into some like messed up parts of our human psyche. But the fact that it's the main author is actually the writer and the creator, and it's his story. And then, not to spoil anything, but there's a pivotal character in it that has been revealed in the real world. And she's now doing interviews and arguing against the truth of this story. So it's just like fascinating. I can't stop watching. I feel like I see like baby reindeer examples everywhere.
It's a mysterious title, and don't be thrown by it. And we're not spoiling it here, but you'll just have to give it a try. If you're ready to have your thinking messed up.
We'll warn you. It's very dark and very messed up and gets into a lot of trigger warning type of things. But if you're someone who likes to go to those places, you'll be fascinated.
Yeah, well, there's definitely a lot of commentary to be read into it in terms of where we are as a society. Natalie, you've got so much to offer, and I just appreciate even in this conversation how you've been so succinct but so rich in every answer and every thought. So thank you so much for that. What are the best ways for the Teachers on Fire interested in you and your work, your message, to follow you and connect?
If you want to connect, the main space that I'm creating in right now is LinkedIn, like you mentioned. And some of you might be like, wait, what? LinkedIn's a social media space? Yes. And it's actually it's starting to really thrive and grow. I was on X, like many of, I'm sure like you, Tim, many of your listeners. I've dabbled on Instagram, but I have to say LinkedIn is such a positive space. People are so uplifting and really want to have good conversations. So I've been finding I'm very motivated to tell my story and connect with new people on there. So LinkedIn would be the main answer.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I still like Education X, even as it's evolved a little bit, still find some valuable conversations there. But I agree that it feels like the quality on LinkedIn and I'll say trajectory, I guess, just the positive growth mindset, we're building each other up kind of vibe is just that much stronger on LinkedIn. So,
I mean, the power of having your CV connected, right? And your actual face.
Yeah.
Really changes the vibe.
That is true. I haven't thought about that particular quality, but removing all of the anonymous accounts is a breath of fresh air as well. So,
yeah.
Yes. Well, that sounds good, Natalie. That's very simple and easy for listeners. So again, find her on LinkedIn. I want to thank you, Natalie, so much for sharing your time with the podcast today. This has been fun and inspiring for me. And I hope we will continue to talk more. Teachers on Fire, I'm your host, Tim Cavey, and I'm so grateful that you decided to spend some of your day listening to this podcast. I hope that in some way the content you heard today from Natalie Vardabasso sparked your thinking and ignited your practice. And I'll meet you next week right here, same time, same place on the Teachers on Fire podcast. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
I never answer to no, man, I still go, 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 yeah, go, go, go. Hustle hard, hustle every single day.